Hi, I'm Earl Taylor, Chief Knowledge Officer at the Marketing Science Institute. As many of you know, MSI helps marketers become better marketers. Our businesses and academic thought leaders collaborate to create new marketing knowledge, which we share in a variety of ways. One of the most popular is our online lecture series. Those of you attending today represent many business sectors such as technology, financial services, CPG, media, and more, as well as MSI members such as Colgate, Eli Lilly, SC Johnson, Warner Media, Teradata, and others. We're delighted to welcome you to learn more about how vigilant marketers keep their companies ahead. Now, before we begin, I'd like to point out the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please use this feature to send through any questions you have during the presentation. We'll gather the questions and have a brief Q&A session following the presentation. Now, I'd like to introduce you to today's featured speaker. George Estey is a Jeffrey T. Boyce Emeritus Professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. He was previously the Executive Director of the Marketing Science Institute and the founder and co-director of the Mack Institute for Innovation Management. He's been a consultant to numerous corporations such as GE, IBM, MetLife, Unilever, DuPont, Johnson & Johnson, and many others. He's the past chairman of the American Marketing Association. His primary areas of activity are marketing, strategy, organic growth and innovation, organizational change, and competitive strategies in global markets. He's authored 19 books in areas of marketing and strategic management, has won 10 Best Article Awards and 1 Best Book Award. And in 2011, he was chosen as one of the 11 legends in marketing. He's certainly a legend here at MSI, and we're delighted to have George today to talk to us about how vigilant marketers keep their companies ahead. George?
Thank you, Earl, and thank each of you for joining me today. We're going to be talking, as Earl suggested, the pivotal role of what I call vigilant marketers. The work we're going to be talking about and the way we're going to answer the question about how is through a really deep exploration of a 10-year research journey that culminated in the book See Sooner, Act Faster that just came out in early October. And so the idea here is that there's always been a premium on vigilance, but it's just been magnified terrifically in this era of digital turbulence. And by turbulence, I mean the kind of irregular, nonlinear, erratic, and unanticipated events that come to companies all over the world. And it's magnified by digital advances, AI, AR, data analytics, Internet of Things. All of these can combine in very unpredictable ways to just magnify turbulence, create remarkable opportunities, but also devastating threats. So I hope this will be a useful lens for you and your company. So why the title? See Sooner, Act Faster. The basic idea behind the book and what I'm going to be talking about today is that if you firstly see and understand weak signals of threats and opportunities ahead of your rivals, you can then explore them deeply and get yourself positioned to act when the time is right. Through, say, probe and learn market studies, buying real options such as taking a stake in a technology company, running experiments, and we'll talk about how vigilant organizations do all these things. And then when the time is right, you can act quickly and ahead of your rivals. Now, that takes me to the second slide, which is the need for this ability, as I suggested, has been magnified in this era of digital turbulence. And of course, I was using Peter Drucker's definition of turbulence, but I want to call out importantly that he follows it by saying the underlying causes can be analyzed, predicted, and managed. And that very much defines what we're going to be talking about. In an era of great uncertainty, you can still manage that uncertainty and profit from it. So we're going to be looking at the long-run dangers and rich opportunities outside of your focal vision, that is where you're concentrating attention. And by seeing emerging threats and opportunities from the periphery, vigilant organizations have a lot more degrees of freedom. Another way of thinking about it is that if you're vulnerable, and we'll be talking about why organizations are often vulnerable, you're forced to react to someone else's move, and you lose your degrees of freedom. So the agenda that we're going to be following is firstly to understand why vigilant organizations are really better at seeing sooner and acting faster, and what are the factors underlying that. But of greater interest, perhaps, is how can you improve vigilance? And this is especially a responsibility and a pivotal role for the marketing leader. So just to suggest some of the reasons why vigilance matters so much, I've got some examples here of very familiar both successes and failures. So we can see that Nike was way ahead in anticipating the opportunities from online customer engagement. And it was more than 6 years ago now, I believe, that they pretty much stopped any print advertising and went totally online. Another example of a vigilant organization is Adobe and their Photoshop. Way back being 10 years ago, they sold most Photoshop as a shrink-wrapped software package, and the user basically owned the Photoshop application, and they control it. But Adobe could see the cloud and the potential for storing images on the cloud as a potential and very dangerous problem for them. So they decided that they would put Photoshop into a subscription model and load it onto the cloud, which is where it is now. And they took a lot of heat for that move initially, but it has led to them being one of the great digital success stories. But they couldn't have done it without seeing the opportunity well ahead of some of the rivals like Oracle, Microsoft, and Google, who all, by the way, could have gotten into their business and have not, because Adobe is such a strong presence, powerful brand with great capabilities. The flip side of vigilance is vulnerability, where you are slow in understanding weak signals of threats and opportunities, and you pay a substantial price. You'll be familiar with Wells Fargo and its debacle, but there are many others like Radio Shack, which missed a trend that it actually started. It goes back in the history of Radio Shack, where they were the go-to place for electronics hobbyists. They lost their way when they decided to pursue the opportunity to sell mobile phones, and completely committed to that business and turned their stores away from serving hobbyists. Now, unfortunately, what they did not anticipate, and we'll use anticipation a lot, is they didn't watch their competitors. So all of the major companies, including AT&T, started going direct and bypassing Radio Shack. Well, that put them in a very difficult position, and to double their problems, they missed the opportunities that are now emerging for hobbyists to use a lot of the new digital technologies and capabilities, and they're not present. They're not regarded as relevant, and they're bankrupt. But I find the See Sooner, Act Faster lens very helpful in understanding, for example, you may have seen that Forever 21, the big retail chain, has just declared bankruptcy. And part of the problem was that they missed the signals that younger consumers were prioritizing sustainability. And, of course, fast fashion, which is what they specialized in, is anything but a sustainable garment, which is what they sold. And so they, again, lost relevance. But meanwhile, their major competitors saw the threat looming. So that raises the question then, why organizations are surprised, and no more surprising is what dreadful news is coming out of Boeing these days. So there's a number of factors and forces going on, and it starts with an organization that is inherently vulnerable because they're focused on their current core business. They're very short-term in outlook, and they have what I call an inside-out mindset. That is, to consider any growth opportunities, they say, well, what are we good at, and where could we apply our current technology, our current capabilities, as contrasted with starting in the marketplace, which is what marketers are adroit at doing, and saying, what can we do to serve our customers' emerging needs? That goes along with a lack of curiosity, and this is particularly manifested in lack of curiosity in the leadership team, and they're not communicating that downwards in the organization, which leads then to poor information sharing. But in all the research we've done, and we've now talked to and surveyed well over 340 organizations, it is fundamentally a story initially of leadership. Weak, short-term, and focused leadership, which is their vulnerability is magnified when future shock comes. Now, Future Shock was a book that Alvin Toffler wrote in the 80s, and he was very prescient, speaking about Vigilant, but he defined future shock as too much change in too short a time. And that leads to signal overload. The signal-to-noise ratio is very poor, and there's a great deal of confusion. So you combine those two together, and you have vulnerability, which means you're always on your back foot and always reacting rather than anticipating and taking the lead. So that all comes together in the model that I'm going to share with you, which is the foundation for the work we've done, and we have tested this extensively and found that there are two big factors that really shape whether an organization is vigilant or vulnerable, and those are leadership posture and their approach to foresight. But let me explain further what we have on this chart. The spectrum on the top goes from low vigilance, which is characteristic of vulnerable organizations, over to highly vigilant. And so when I do a compare and contrast about vulnerable versus vigilant, those are extreme cases. Most organizations are somewhere in a medium posture, but weak in one or more of these four factors. So consistently, though, everything starts with the leadership posture, and we've seen some elements of this already. But let's look at a vigilant organization. And they certainly play the long game. By that I mean they're looking out over the horizon, trying to anticipate what's coming around the corner, to mix a number of metaphors. They're also very open to challenging their assumptions. They're also very open to diverse inputs, not only from their places that are familiar and comfortable, but outside. And one of the characteristics is that they network pretty widely outside their comfortable industry settings. And so when we talk about a vigilant organization, it's first and foremost defined by the leadership posture. And you can see the contrasting profile for a vulnerable organization. They also approach how they make strategy in a very different way. Vigilant organizations, much more outside in, and again, I can reference companies like Adobe, Amazon. They start by looking at their organization from the perspective of their customers and their competitors, channel partners, and they say, and something we'll talk a lot more about as we get into the role of the marketer, that allows them to think more broadly. They cast a wider net, and they're also developing strategy that embraces uncertainty. So they do a lot of scenario thinking and don't try to make point forecasts. The second most influential factor, however, is the approach to foresight. And this is something, again, our research has really documented, that they invest a lot in a disciplined search for opportunities. They take a real options approach. So they're willing to spend a lot on small-scale investments, mostly to learn, but if they don't work out, then they're not committed to invest further. An experimental mindset is prevailing. Now, one of the most interesting factors on the vulnerable organizations and their approach to foresight is that we find in our data that they consistently view a failure as an error, as contrasted with a learning opportunity. And of course, that pervades the whole culture. People have become very risk averse, and keep their head down. As a consequence, in their approach to foresight, they're very reactive, and their strategy and capability processes are very formulaic. And lastly, the vigilant organizations have a very clear line of accountability. They're very good at information sharing, as opposed to trapping information in silos, which is a characteristic. And so you'll all recognize the problem of weak signals being captured in some silo, and the people don't forward it. And that's vertically, and there's also horizontal sharing. So sharing turns out to be a big factor. So let me now turn to a summary of some of the key lessons, and that will lead us into what the model looks like and how, in particular, we can improve vigilance. So number one is this notion that vigilance is more about anticipation than prediction. And that is, you want to see things, as Jack Welch said, coming around the corner before they're really fully formed. And that leads to lesson number two, which is something we have discovered in all of our postmortems. When a firm was surprised, missed an opportunity, didn't see a threat coming until too late, there was always somebody who knew about it in the organization or in the extended network. But here's the rub. Leadership didn't know that they knew about this threat or opportunity, and they didn't know leadership needed to know. Now, in that, it's not a particularly profound insight, but it is the kernel of the change process, and of course highlights the need to create knowledge and sharing of concerns. We'll talk about how to build dynamic capabilities that are enhanced by investments in foresight, but this is an investment, and it's an investment, by the way, that pays handsomely. There was a study done by a European consortium 2 years ago that tracked large European multinationals over 8 years, and they classified them as vigilant or vulnerable using much of our work. And they found that the increase in market cap over the 8 years from roughly 2010 to 2018 was double the rate of increase in market cap for vulnerable organizations. So what really I think is an important takeaway is that it's all about the leadership team and their curiosity, their openness. But the problem is that the collective attention of a leadership team is a really valuable resource that's easily squandered. So what I'm going to present now is the kind of change process that we have discovered works in a variety of organizations in the both profit sector, the for-profit sector, and in the nonprofit sector. We've applied this model to the Council on Foundations and 100 foundations, for example. So the step that is pivotal is firstly demonstrating leadership commitment. And so what I'm going to do is talk about why that's important and how this might happen. And that'll set us up for the role of marketing. Again, excuse me, I'm going to bring in Peter Drucker again, and his point still applies. Only three things happen naturally in organizations: friction, confusion, and underperformance. Leadership is what makes the difference. So how do you go about demonstrating leadership commitment to vigilance? And I love this quote by Isaac Asimov, and it's about a discovery, and it turns out the new discoveries are preceded by, but not by somebody saying, "Eureka, I found it," but oh, that's funny. I mean, let's go back to things like penicillin. There was an aberration, an anomaly. So one of the things we find is that leadership is curious and really likes to dissect anomalies, things that they can't quite understand. Much of the book is devoted to how to go about implementing this demonstration, but it does require spending substantially more time thinking about the future. Bringing in diverse perspectives, and that's the role of networking, and but networking way outside your comfortable industry setting. So if you're, for example, potentially susceptible to someone who can use blockchain technologies very adroitly, and you don't see this coming, the antidote is to get involved in industry, that is, groups that are exploring. For example, there's a couple of big institutes that explore and create communities of interest around the potential for blockchain. And that brings up why digital technologies are so difficult to deal with, because the rate of progress and advancement is so astonishing. We strongly endorse sharing stories about vigilance and dissecting anomalies. That is, spending time in the leadership meeting describing unexpected results, things that don't fit the business model, that are disturbing in some respects, and making sure everybody knows about them. And then, of course, the board is a critical force in any vigilance exercise, and we can speak much more about that. So the second one is this second biggest lever in improving your vigilance, what we call the vigilance quotient, is to invest a lot in foresight. And by a lot, I mean maybe 2 or 3% of sales, which is contrasted with the 0.25% in a vulnerable organization. But Andy Grove made this point way back in a wonderful book called Only the Paranoid Survive. He's the founder of Intel, and his book really set us on the path to explore more deeply what it means to be vigilant. There's a key element of it is scanning widely and thinking deeply about the periphery. For example, I'm going to skip to the next slide, and that's one where we have, both my colleague, Paul Schumacher, my co-author, and I work for, that turns out, different chocolate confectionery companies, but with their collective permission, we put together this chart, which is designed to really I think, capture the idea of scanning much more widely than in your focal area. That is the current business. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but you'll see that there's some major areas that you've got to pay attention to if you're in chocolate confectionery, which is a pretty stable business. And so the idea of a vigilant chocolate confectionery company is that they've got to be sensitive to everything from supply instability over on the left and the political, legal, social, and economic forces. But in the long run, climate change is going to affect their source of supply. Now, supply instability is becoming increasingly unstable, with Turkey being a major source of, for example, hazelnuts. And certainly it's a very troubled area. And if you're reliant on hazelnuts as the core product in your chocolate confectionery, you'd have to be very worried. Now, that's a case of a weak signal becoming very, very focal. But there are many, many others. The ones in red suggest that even though we've got a very mature industry, that technology advances that are highlighted in the red can potentially impact you. And so that's just an indication of how widely you have to scan. Investing in foresight also means investing in a search for opportunities. For example, 3M invests heavily in understanding lead users. These are users who have needs well in advance of the rest of the market. And Eric von Hippel has been the real thought leader in this area, and 3M has discovered how powerful it is, and it's their principal tool, but it's expensive. And so when I talk about a systematic or disciplined search for opportunities, this is a major investment on their part. But you can also invest to learn from your defectors and complainers. Another investment in foresight is, and I'll jump down to the bottom, sorry, I'm back on slide 20, and that is to do a red teaming, to try to anticipate competitors' moves. Now, these are all time-consuming and yet extraordinarily valuable, because red teaming is a term that came out of the military, and it is used to describe role-playing of each of the leaders of your major competitors and trying to think like them. So you'll notice a lot of this is based upon outside-in thinking, and now we're starting to see where the particular role and capabilities of the leader, the marketing leader, will be so important. So let's go to number 3 factor, which is, okay, in order to become more vigilant, you have to start thinking about how you make your strategy and change that. So I've talked a lot about starting the strategy dialogue from the outside in. We advocate, and something that I will not be able to spend a lot of time in, is this notion of guiding questions to help focus the attention and utilize the scarce attention resource of the leadership team. But it means learning from the past. Well, what have we missed in the past? Interrogate the present deeply, and try to anticipate the future. So we will use a lot of tools like scenario analysis to try to think about alternative plausible futures. But let's talk about outside-in thinking and why we've discovered it's so critically important in building a vigilance capability. So by outside in, I mean starting with the standing outside the organization on the right and asking ourselves, as Jeff Bezos does so effectively, well, what are the needs of our present and prospective customers? How are they changing? Let's look at the world through their eyes. What new competitors are coming along? Rather than being surprised from them, let's try to think through who might be potentially able to meet the needs that our present and prospective customers are having. A crucial question, of course, is what's our value advantage, and how could it be displaced by an emerging technology? So that's the outside-in approach. Now, and this is a very large topic, but it does require an enormous amount of empathy and willingness to stand back from your own organization. Now, this does not mean, in the next slide, that we don't ignore inside-out thinking. So these two approaches are highly complementary. But inside-out approaches to strategy making and the strategy dialogue are all about how can we sell more? What else can we do with what we're good at? And that is important, and especially in, say, drug development with the new breakthrough drugs, you start off with what the technology discoveries are, and then consider what the opportunities are. But the reason we advocate starting with an outside-in approach, which is so much a characteristic of the role of the marketing leader, is that it enhances vigilance by creating a much wider perspective on the organization. Inside-out thinking is deeply rooted in your current view of the world and is circumscribed by your existing market definition and your current capabilities. But that's way too narrow a perspective. And so we can come back to that. I'd love to explore it further in the questions. But let's finally turn now to the role of marketing, and I'll leave this final slide on the program for becoming more vigilant, saying that part of the challenge is just to get the organization aligned, and by clarifying accountability, being much more open, and sharing information. We find consistently that vigilant organizations have a lot of small, short-lived task force teams that follow the famous two-pizza rule, that is, you never have a team bigger than can be fed by two pizzas. All right, so that sets the stage for the final, and I think those of you in marketing leadership roles, the penultimate question that we're going to tackle here in this webinar. Well, I posed the question, what's the role of the marketing leader? Well, the question is, firstly, who is the marketing leader? And perhaps you can find your role in here, or your title. This is just a small sampling I could get on the one slide, but at the top are real marketing leaders: Chief Marketing Officer, Chief Commercial Officer, Chief Customer Officer. But at the bottom, these tend to be much more supportive. And so in order to understand where you are, and then what you might do to enhance your capabilities and influence is I've put together a list of possible responsibilities, and starting with the top three, which I think are where marketing is most influential. That is, it's a trusted advisor to the CEO. And that means, importantly, that you're part of the leadership team. You're not there just to represent the responsibilities and activities of the marketing. You're not an advocate for marketing. Rather, you're an advisor to the CEO to maximize the strategy and position the organization for the future. It's important that the organization have a single point of contact for marketing and sales. But first and foremost, perhaps, in this list is that you've got to be a credible, in order to have a lot of influence on improving vigilance, you've got to be the credible and recognized source of market insights. In short version, representing the voice of the customer. Now, there's others that we can look at, but in the interest of time, I want to move on and really suggest what this could mean, and by putting these indicators, these are some indicia, you'll notice at the bottom, the last two are stewards of the brand asset, chief communicator. Those are important roles, but what we're finding is that marketing has greater influence and plays a much more significant role in building a vigilance capability when it has the top three. And that leads to the notion that the beginning is to assess your contribution to vigilance by scoring yourself on that previous slide. And what we find is that the people who are most influential get a score of 6 to 10. Now, this tends to be much more in FMCG companies, and there's a lot of potential in technology companies to improve their ability in this domain, to really create and develop a marketing leader who is truly a top-line leader. And they will be the driver of the Foresight investments we talked about earlier. But perhaps the last bullet is the most significant one. They have to be a partner with the CEO to advocate for outside-in thinking. That is, start the strategy dialogue and provide the kind of deep insights into current and potential customers, current potential competitors, where your channel partners are going, and that requires that you be a credible player and be willing to work closely with your functional peers in the leadership team. Now, what we find is that majority of marketing leaders are more better described as market advocates or as service resources. Now, these are valuable roles, but they're not going to necessarily dictate how effective an organization is in anticipating what's coming around the corner. So a market advocate is a score of 4 or 5 out of 10 on that previous scale, and they tend to be more coordinators and communicators. You see this in many B2B distributor companies and so forth. They have an important role with customer relationship management processes, databases, and their influence has been growing as data analytics enables us to unlock the secrets in the database. They also will be partners in the innovation process. But that doesn't have nearly as much influence on the vigilance capability of the organization. And then there are a good number in particularly the technology sector where marketing is a service resource. Managing marketing services, they do the market insight studies, but one of the key activities, of course, is sales support. So the marketing leader can do a tremendous amount to position the organization to get ready for what's coming around the corner. They should be able to anticipate and alert the organization to do what one of our clients called collect the paranoia and make sure the rest of the leadership team pays attention to it. In those kinds of vigilant organizations with marketing as a top-line leader, I'll wrap up and remind you what Charles Darwin said over 160 years ago. It's not the strongest of the species who survive, nor the most intelligent, but the ones most responsive to change. And that's what vigilance is. It's being able to see what's coming and respond and be ready to respond when the time is right. So I've shared our excitement over our intellectual journey in defining what it is to be vigilant, and I would really welcome your questions and observations. So, Earl.
Thanks very much, George. Yeah, great. Thanks. A lot of good thought there, and a couple of folks have asked during the course of the talk. This is being recorded. It will be on our website. You'll be receiving a follow-up email with a link to the recorded version, so you can go back through it at your leisure. And I would remind everyone once again that a lot of the insights that George has shared and much more is in his recent book, See Sooner, Act Faster. So I can refer you to that for additional details. I want to remind the group again that if you please send your questions directly to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll address those in the time remaining. As those questions are coming in, George, I wanted to have you come back to something that for me is a real fundamental takeaway, and that is the distinction you made between anticipation and prediction. And if I'm right, it seems to me that this notion of anticipation relates to your concept of real options or degrees of freedom. It's not a definitive statement that this will happen. It's more of a what-if scenario planning kind of a mindset. And exactly. To me, that's sort of fundamental to what you're sharing about the difference between vigilant organizations and those that are maybe operationally very good at doing what they do, but not so much at adapting. So maybe you elaborate a bit more on that distinction.
Oh, absolutely. Although I must say you did a very nice job of capturing the basic issue. Let's start with prediction, because prediction means that we have a lot of experience in this domain, and we've got a lot of data upon which we can make a forecast. But in this world of digital turbulence, which is accentuating all the turbulence, as we saw in the chocolate industry, much of the predictions fall by the wayside because there's just way too much uncertainty. And so you need to be able to anticipate. That is, build an organization that's on high alert. Now, we also have to be mindful that we're in an environment now where the amount of data, not necessarily insight or knowledge, is doubling every 18 months. So we run a risk of being overwhelmed by the number of weak signals. And so anticipation means being disciplined about it. And you properly called out the notion of scenarios as a way to deal with uncertainty and being focused in where you look, what we call guiding questions. What are the issues that we should be paying attention to? And that was, by the way, the source of the concerns and issues in the chocolate industry. And so there are a tremendous number that you've got to be alert to. And being vigilant is not only being able to anticipate, but it's also being disciplined about where you focus your scarce attention.
That's a great point, and I wanted to maybe elaborate on that too a little bit and get your thoughts. The wealth of data that we have now, and you alluded to this, the machine learning, artificial intelligence, all the new technologies for taking advantage of all that data, there's a danger perhaps that becomes a bit of an echo chamber. That is, we know what we do now, we can do it better and better, more precisely. We can predict customer behavior based on clickstream data and that sort of thing. But by definition, we're talking about our current customers, the current franchise, not who might be brought into the brand or what the competitive threat outside of our purview might be. So is there a kind of a potential pitfall with all the data and new analytic techniques that we just get better and better at doing what we do, as opposed to, as you say, anticipating changes that could be disruptive?
Yeah, I was intrigued, Earl, that you used the word predict. Because when we got a big data set, and we, by the way, are enormously advantaged by being able to identify patterns in that data, but we got to recognize databases are historic. That is what's happening recently and perhaps even in the distant past. What we're interested in vigilance, and the reason why anticipation is so important, we got to see what's coming next and position the organization so that we're in a position of a company like Adobe that did see a real game changer coming over the horizon, but they saw it ahead of anybody else. Importantly, you will eventually get the message, but you don't want to get the message of a looming competitive threat or a terrific opportunity that's too late when others have seen it sooner and have already captured it. So by all means, use deep data analytics to extract patterns, but don't confuse that with understanding what's coming over the horizon.
That's well said, yeah. I want to come back to something else you said, though, that's really important, I think, and it relates to this notion of kind of changing the corporate culture, the role of marketing in the organization. And that is getting the incentives right, you know, for the test, fail, and learn mentality, as opposed to regarding every failure as, you know, somebody's responsibility that's going to, you know, affect their career path in the organization. I know your colleague, one of our other academics, Abby Griffin, has looked at what works to have individuals succeed again and again in developing new technologies or new products within organizations, serial entrepreneurs. And part of what it is their willingness to sort of challenge the prevailing incentive structure norms and kind of stick their necks out. Any advice for the audience here about how you really align the incentives for this knowledge sharing which otherwise can seem, you mentioned, people knew that this was a coming change. They didn't realize that management needed to know that, and so they failed to act when they might have been able to otherwise. So your thoughts about aligning the incentives for knowledge sharing and for that more risk-taking culture?
So, Earl, that's a great question. There's two parts to it. One is that you have to diagnose yourself and be realistic about how vigilant you are. That's why in our book we offer a diagnostic tool to assess your vigilance quotient. And often in our consulting arrangements and commitments, we will give this to the whole leadership team. And more often than not, it's the attitude towards failures where the leadership team recognizes and steps up to the fact that we don't tend to learn from failures. Instead, we bury them, we search for someone to blame, and so forth. So how can you get out of that trap? And that's the second part of your question, is how do you go about aligning incentives to encourage people to both take risks and more generally bring forward weak signals of concerns and problems? It's a combined question of putting the right metrics in, and that's part of it, creating the right kind of dashboard. But it's also just a matter of recognition. Let's go back to Andy Grove. He made it very clear that people would be commended, called out, acknowledged if they came from 4 levels down and in Asia and sent him their concerns directly, and he would acknowledge that, celebrate it, and then often that would be a pathway to promotion. In other words, he was making it entirely permissible and encouraged to bring the paranoia forward. Then you can tie specific rewards to it, but frankly, what we find in this domain is that recognition and encouragement is what matters most.
That's a great upbeat note to end on. Again, thanks, George, for a really great presentation. I encourage the audience to check out the book for further details. We will be sending the recording of the webinar soon, and if you have additional questions about the presentation, you can follow up with George at dayg@wharton.upenn.edu. I want to remind the audience that since 1961, nonprofit MSI has brought together the best minds in marketing from major corporations and top business schools around the world to improve business practice by applying science to marketing's biggest challenges. Thanks again for joining us for our lecture series, and we hope to see you at the next one.